This is an old family story that has been passed down from my in laws and remains a bit of a mystery. My grandma in law and father in law spoke of it often, but my no nonsense grandpa in law denied it as he got older. The story starts when my grandparents in law buy their dream home in the 1980s. After years of hard work, they buy a large piece on the outskirts of my hometown. It was beautiful, the perfect home for entertaining, and they always had guests over. For the grandma, it was the crown jewel of her life. Anyways, the family was very into the Old West and cowboys and Indians type stuff. So they would bring home Native American artifacts they would find and display them. This obviously has some ethical questions around it, but at the time, most people in my hometown didn't think that way. The appearance of the cowboy supposedly started after one such artifact was placed on the mantle. It's hard to say if they were actually linked, but the family seemed to think so. After the artifact was brought in, the shadow man started coming around. Randomly, when the family would eat dinner, they would see him at the end of the hallway. He was hard to make out with not many clear features, but had what looked like a cowboy hat on his head. He would just stand there and watch, stepping back out of view when you would turn to look at him. This went on for several months before one day my grandpa-in-law decided that enough was enough. He threw down his dinner fork, jumped out of his chair and ran at the figure. The shadow man then turned and ran into the bedroom where my grandpa confronted him. Supposedly, the figure stopped in its tracks, turned around, faced my grandpa, and disappeared. He never returned again after this, with my grandpa successfully scaring him off. To this day, I don't know what this could have been, but it's in our family folklore, and I have no reason to disbelieve my grandmother-in-law over what she experienced. I wasn't born at this time, but it remains a favourite family ghost story. Have you ever gotten a strange phone call right when you mentioned a loved one who's passed? If you have, you know how strange it can be. This incident in particular happened late one night in my grandma-in-law's kitchen. Grandma had a sister-in-law who was visiting from the East Coast. She had gotten in late that night, and I went over to visit the two of them with my husband. We were all sitting around the kitchen table, the same one my grandpa-in-law's mother had owned when she built the house. There were a lot of jokes going around the table, and Grandma started coughing from laughing too hard. Now, she was in poor health as it was, and she was supposed to be taking breathing treatments. However, with her having so much fun, a rare occasion since Grandpa had passed, she didn't want to leave the table. My husband was concerned and told her she had to take her treatments. After some convincing, she got up and started heading in that direction. But then she got sucked back into the conversation and distraction from her treatment again. She again started coughing heavily. This was the moment when my husband told her again she needed to take her treatment. If Grandpa saw you right now, he'd be nagging you to take your treatment, my husband told me. That's right, Grandma's sister-in-law said. Don't make me have him call you. Grandma gave a little, yeah, right, kind of chuckle. Right at that moment, the sister-in-law's track phone that she only uses when travelling started to ring. We all stood there, spooked for a moment, and the sister-in-law went to answer it. It immediately disconnected when she opened it after several rings. The weirdest part was that this was at around 11:30 East Coast time on a phone that no one would have the number for outside of immediate family. Grandma immediately took her breathing treatment after that, not wanting to argue with what could have been a message from beyond the grave. Her husband had always reminded her about her treatments while alive, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to do the same after. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but I like to think it was Grandpa. I know that my grandma felt that way too, especially after other instances of footsteps in the house and sounds of him getting up in the night for water. long after he passed. Did anyone else grow up in a haunted house? I grew up in an old home that was decorated almost entirely with antiques, and I had many experiences throughout the years. My room itself had a mid-1800s wooden bed with matching dresser, and throughout the home were Victorian hair wreaths, daguerreotypes, and other old oddities. The side of the yard that my room overlooked was actually enclosed by an old iron fence from a cemetery. It was creepy, to say the least. Every night when I went to bed, I would tense up and feel paralyzed, like something was watching me right outside my door. It wasn't just me. Anytime friends stayed over, they felt something there. It got to the point where friends would never stay over. It really was that bad. The first odd thing to happen besides that feeling was with my Barbie washing machine. On probably 5 separate occasions, it randomly turned on in the middle of the night. I would be completely asleep and wake up to the whirling sound of the toy, which he had to push the button in on to get it to go. A few years after that, I woke one night to see a girl in my room. She was probably around 5 with long hair and a long white Victorian nightgown. It was floor length with long sleeves. She was transparent with a blue sheen to her from the way the light cast in the window. She stood at a little toy crib next to my bed and started touching my stuffed animals. "Do you like my toys?" I asked. At that moment, she looked startled, as if she hadn't noticed me there before. She turned and ran for the door, vanishing before she got there. The whole experience was actually really peaceful and not scary how most people picture a ghost encounter going. The next weird thing was a radio that went on in my room. It was a little battery-operated radio I had gotten for selling magazines at school, and I had never used it. One day, after I left my room and walked down the hall, the radio started blaring opera music. Again, I had never used it, so it was odd it would just turn on. Then, there were 2 times my phone disappeared. It might sound odd, but both times it went missing, I knew before I returned to where I left it. Randomly, the thought that it was missing would pop up in my head, and when I went back, it would be gone. Both times, it showed up randomly in the center of the room an hour or so later. The final story I'll mention, although there are more happenings, is the time a friend came over to communicate with the spirits. She was a self-described medium, and I didn't really believe her, but I was curious as to what she would say. She went down to my basement, full of antiques, and said she could sense a man down there. I didn't really know what to believe, but when she mentioned he was walking upstairs, the stairs started to creak. A minute later, she said he was coming back down, and they started creaking again. The weird part is those stairs never creak unless someone is on them. She continued through the house and picked up on another spirit, this time of a woman who was supposedly attached to a black Victorian perfume bottle, according to my friend. After that, I took my friend home, ready to be done with the ghost stuff. When I pulled up in the driveway, I looked up and saw a woman in the kitchen window. I figured it was my mom doing her nightly dishwash, but after I exited my car, I realized her car was gone. No one was home but me. I called my parents and refused to go in the house until they got home. They made fun of me for it, like with my other experiences, but for me, it wasn't fun at all. It was truly bizarre. Anyways, those are some of my experiences at that house. The last few times I was there, I didn't notice anything that felt off. And that being watched feeling has mostly gone away. Sometimes I wonder if I've just lost my ability to sense things over the years, or if the energy really is different. It happened one night on an old country road. My now husband and his best friend were hanging out well after dark with the rest of the guys in the friend group. It was an old dirt road with nothing around. One of those roads you know well if you grew up in the country. They dubbed it Burnout Road. They were all cracking jokes and tossing back energy drinks when suddenly they heard something from the ditch across the road. Out of nowhere, behind some trees, a voice said, "Daddy?" It sounded like that of a boy between the ages of 4 and 7, with the pitch going up at the end as if the boy was scared and calling out for his father. Only my husband and his best friend heard it. The rest of the group were oblivious. My husband saw the perplexed look on his friend's face and said, "What did it say?" He wanted to affirm he heard the same thing before his logical friend could deny it. "Daddy," his friend said. Years later, my husband told me the story. I decided it would be fun to go back there and see if anything else would happen. We went down to the old burnout road, this time in the daytime because I was too scared to try at night. And the daylight caused us to notice something that the group had never noticed when they were there in the dark. Behind the trees where the voice had come from, there was a burned out house. It was so damaged that it was mostly a basement at that point. The overgrowth of trees had hidden it in the dark, and the daylight gave us a different view. There were still some objects strewn around, including some toys. Based on how the objects looked, it seems like the house burned down in the 1980s or 90s. I scoured newspaper records online to see if I could find anything about the fire, but there was nothing. I have to wonder though if that voice was some sort of imprint left behind by a child who lived through it. Later on, there would be other phenomena that only my husband and his best friend would notice. It seems like the two of them had some sort of perception that the rest of their friends lacked. I know a lot of people like to think of ghosts as imagination or hallucinations, but how do you explain two people experiencing the same phenomena multiple times? There has to be something out there. It all started in the 1980s, when my husband's family moved into an old farmhouse. It was one of those dark, dilapidated ones you always see in movies about the paranormal, but they're quite common in the rural Midwest town he grew up in. According to his father, the place had served as a stagecoach stop at some point, but later was just a family home. It was 2 stories with a smaller little house on the property as well. My husband's sister's rooms were upstairs against the attic portion, and when my husband was born in the 90s, his room was at the bottom of the stairs. Often as a child, he would fall on those stairs. It would just be poor balance due to being young, but he always felt like something was pushing him, and he was scared of those stairs that bordered his room. On the same level of the house was his parents' bedroom. They would often hear inexplicable sounds in the night while they were trying to sleep. One sound was that of marbles. It sounded like they were rolling across the floor above them, but seemingly without the barrier of walls. They just roll on and on for what seemed like forever. The other sound was the log sound. Often, it would sound like large logs were hitting the roof and rolling down, but whenever they checked, there was nothing to account for it. Up in the middle sister's room, toys moved without explanation. Several times, she would complain about mice moving her toys. Once his mom went upstairs to see a Barbie car moving around as if guided by an invisible hand. Time to time, there'd be whispers heard in the attic as well. My husband's mom was religious and prayed for the spirits to leave. Things seemed to calm down for a while, but the family soon decided to leave, not just because of these happenings, but due to hostile neighbors as well. After moving out, another family soon moved in to rent the property. A while later, his mom ran into them and struck up a conversation about how they were adjusting to the home. Apparently, They had been hearing constant whispering in the attic and had confined themselves only to the bottom level. Whatever my husband's family had experienced had gotten much worse since their new family moved in, to the point that they refused to use half of the house. Over time, they spoke less and less of the house, but we do have several hundred photos that were taken when they lived there. Weirdly, all of the photos are very dark, and double exposures are very common, but weirdly only happen in photos that the middle sister is in. I'm not sure exactly what went on in that house. There was definitely a lot of creepy stuff going on. It was a few years back when we were driving on an industrial road in the town we live in. We passed some train tracks and suddenly experienced the slip. It's hard to explain if you've never experienced it, but it's almost like something imprinted a memory on our brain. Instead of the industrial paved road, it was an older rural gravel road with tall golden grass and no buildings. It looked like the 40s or 50s. A man was pulled off of the side of the road, looking angrily at us as if we had done something terrible, and was angered we had come upon him. The mood was very go now or else. Then just like that, reality snapped back into place. During this slip, there was no sound. It was only visual and lasting a fraction of a second. The best way to describe it is if all of our consciousness is a movie reel and someone spliced a short flashback in the middle of the reel. After the experience, my husband and I were both very quiet. And then he said to me, "Did you feel that?" I had him tell me what he experienced so that there was no way he could be changing his story to fit mine. It was one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. My boyfriend, 23 male, and I, 21 female, just moved into our new apartment together a little over a month ago. Ever since we moved in, I've always felt like there's something weird in our apartment. At first, we chalked it up to both of us just being nervous in our new place, or just us not putting things away carefully, or just being clumsy, but things keep happening. I've always been more sensitive to these things. Spirits and emotions are so easily picked up on, and my family has always been aware of it. My grandma used to work at the church, so when she moved here, she came and blessed the house with me to help me feel safer, since I already didn't like how the apartment felt dirty spiritually. Anyway, the first week here, we had a stove spoon, the ceramic thing to hold your cooking utensil so it doesn't get your stove of counters dirty. It was that and a pot that were the only things on a drying rack inside of the sink, so they were snugly wedged in. When we woke up at 6 to get ready for work, we heard a loud crash, like something was thrown, and went to the kitchen to see it, and the pot both on the ground. The ceramic spoon was completely shattered, and we chalked it up to us not putting it away properly, when I knew there was no way for it to just fall out, especially when it had some distance from the sink. Then I started waking up with bruises and having nightmares. I work at a vet clinic, so I chalked the bruises up to aggressive animals. But when I took a week off of work for personal reasons, I was still getting new ones. I chalked it up to me just being clumsy, but I still had no clue what's going on and still don't. This morning, again at 6 a.m, I started to have a really strange dream. There was a little girl who was just kicking and kicking and kicking at my legs. I surprisingly got super annoyed and stomped trying to kick her back. But as soon as I did, I woke up and my leg was up and already stomping down on my boyfriend's leg as we were both lying down. He woke up from it and cursed. And as he did, we both heard the same giggle and footsteps in our bedroom, like there was someone running out of the room. I'm absolutely terrified, and I've not felt this way in a long time. My shins are red, and they hurt where the little girl was kicking. My heart's still pounding, and I feel like crying. There's just a constant feeling of anxiety in my chest, and I don't know what to do or if I'm going crazy. All our neighbours are older men who don't have kids, and this neighbourhood is generally child-free. I've also had my nephews over previously, and those footsteps were almost identical to small feet running throughout. Am I going crazy? What do I do? I don't mess with spiritual things because I know I'm sensitive to them and just don't want to deal with them. But I've never been physically hurt by them in this way. I'm going to be going to work soon, and honestly, I don't want to come back after. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. I'm not convinced that there is an afterlife where some conscious being survives a bodily death. I'm interested in some possible explanations on what occurred a few weeks ago. I'd really like some skeptics to weigh in with some of their opinions. I suffer from diabetes and as a result have to wake in the evening 2 or 3 times to urinate. It sucks, but I've been living with this for a few years now. My wife and I also have a dog and a cat as well, as 2 wonderful children. Sometimes the dog will also need to go out in the middle of the night. Since I'm used to getting up anyway, I usually get up and let her out. One evening, as the dog barked to indicate she needed to go out, I woke and took her downstairs toward the door to the backyard. However, for a split second, I saw with alarming clarity an old man sitting in a leather chair that we have in our living room. I was just casually glancing over as we went down the stairs from the bedroom area toward the living room and down towards the family room to the back door. It was really an instant. A split second he was there looking at me, and I looked away. And my mind grew ever alert and fully woke me to deal with this intruder. When I glanced back, he was gone. I continued down the stairs to let the dog out. I went back upstairs while she did her business in the backyard. I looked at the chair. Nothing. However, I was getting a very uneasy feeling looking at what wasn't there. It still felt like someone was in it, watching me. As it happens, the dog's food and water bowls are by the chair. I noticed she was out of water, so grabbed the bowl and went to the kitchen to fill it. As I was coming back into the living room, I still felt uneasy approaching that chair. I placed the water down beside the chair and turned to retrieve the dog from the backyard. The routine is she gets in from the yard and gets a drink on her way back up to the bedroom to go to sleep again. I let her in. She proceeds up the stairs with me, waits for my verbal command of okay to let her know she can approach her water and food bowls. She starts and gets to within 12 feet of the bowl and aforementioned chair and stops, staring at the chair. I go to nudge her with my foot and give her another okay to let her know it's fine to get a drink. Her tail goes between her legs and she lets out a low growl and becomes very stiff. I encourage her again with an okay, but nothing. So I tell her, let's go to bed. And she immediately starts up the stairs to the bedroom. When we get upstairs, she's her normal self, except she paws at her empty water bowl in our bedroom. So I go to the master bathroom and fill the bowl quickly for her, and she starts lapping up water. Clearly thirsty, but not willing to approach her bowl by the leather chair. In bed, I start to think about what I had seen. An old man, clearly well-aged and not in good health. If you're a Star Wars fan, think Palpatine-esque around the eyes and pallor of skin. Wispy white hair, clearly thinning over the eyes, limp and greasy. Old yellow teeth with receding gums and wet lips. Pale blue bloodshot eyes with droopy eyelids. Pale skin with pale liver spots. An orange tartan bathrobe with matching slippers. Pale blue pajama pants and button shirts with white buttons and white piping on the seams of the shirt and pants. A large metal pole with a bag of IV solution and a tube with tapped up needle into the back of his left wrinkly hand. This was clearly someone in palliative care and with limited or no mobility. There is an old folks' home in my neighbourhood, but it would be a 15-minute walk from me. An otherwise mobile and healthy individual, but for the diabetes. Not a walk made by a dying man with an IV pole. We have a security system that was armed at the time. When I checked in the morning, none of the doors were open, but for the back door at 3:30 a.m. when I let the dog out. There is video footage of me letting out the dog. We don't have any video in the living room. I can almost dismiss this vision as me being tired and in a half-dream state letting the dog out. What I'm having trouble explaining is my dog's reaction. Granted, she is a bit of a chicken at times. The only time she was truly like this is when she was a pup, growling at some of the Halloween decorations we had outside. I wanted to relieve her of the fear, so I brought her in the house so she could see and not be afraid, but it led her to peeing on the spot in fear. The only other incident we have ever experienced in this house was when my daughter was 15, last year. She was cleaning her closet when she distinctly heard an old man's voice in the closet saying he was going to kill her unless she left. She came to me in tears. I investigated as best I could and thought perhaps she heard something on the TV or her brother's video games. A sound can travel in weird ways. She insisted that the voice was in the closet, and she didn't see anybody, but felt like someone was in there with her. Although I did see an old man, I didn't get a sense of doom or dire feelings, although I did feel uneasy, like one might when walking in a bad neighbourhood at night. Very interested to hear some possible explanations. I grew up in a ranch in Mexico. My family had fields on fields on fields of corn, wheat, and some avocado. I used to play in the cornfield because that was behind my nana's house. It was like a maze. I loved to run around there with my cousins. Well, one evening, I trailed off too deep and I got lost. I was 7 years old when this happened. As it got darker, I began to cry and roaming aimlessly until I was grabbed by my arm. I screamed, but quickly realized that it was my nana's neighbor. In Spanish, she was my nana's comadre. Direct translation of that word is godmother. She baptized 3 of the 13 kids my nana had. In my family, a comadre/compadre is a nickname used as an endearment for the godparents of the kids they baptized. Well, my nana's comadre Petra found me and said, "Maya, why are you out so late? You know stuff creeps at night." I told her I was lost. She reprimanded me gently, but then she told me I was far away from my nana's house, and because it was cold, it would be best to go to her house. I held her hand as she led me to her house. She asked if I was hungry, and I told her I was. She told me she had just made flour tortillas and had beans cooking and should be finished soon. I was happy because that's one of my favorite dishes. We got to her house and it was nice and warm. She sat me on her table and she served me a huge bowl of beans and then cut some queso fresco for me. She made me some mini burritos and I happily ate. She then told me she was going to call my nana, that I was at her house. Again, nothing was out of the ordinary. I felt fine. I ate until I was extremely full. Then, after my nana's comadre came back from calling my nana, she sat across from me and smiled at me. She was a small woman with the prettiest hazel eyes, and she said, "I couldn't get a hold of my comadre or compadre. They must be looking for you, so finish up and wash up." I nodded okay. "Also, I need you to tell my comadre that I am so sorry to have left without telling her goodbye," she added. "You're leaving, Nana Petra?" I asked her, feeling really sad. "Yeah, but don't worry, I will come back when the time is right," she smiled at me. I was really sad. "When are you leaving?" I asked her. "When I drop you off, I'll leave with my daughter," she told me. I was sad, but I agreed to tell my nana. Now that I'd finished eating, I washed my hands at her water pillar, and she led me back to the cornfield. She led me to the middle and she kissed my hair and said, "Keep walking there in a straight line. You'll hear your tata calling out for you, and remember to tell your nana what I said." I told her yes, and began to walk in a straight line like she had pointed out, and I could hear my tatter in the distance. I called back, and we found one another in no time. He was upset. He thought a coyote found me and hurt me, and he reprimanded me until we got to the house where my nana was sitting at the dining room table. I ran up to her, and she asked me where I'd been. I told her that Nana's Petra's house, and she went pale. She asked me to clarify that, and then I told her that she found me, fed me, and brought me to the field when she hadn't been able to reach them on the phone. I told her that she wanted to say goodbye, but she had to leave with her daughter. My nana began to cry, and I was scared because she was very distraught. My tata told me to stop lying, and because my nana was crying, I began to cry with her. I swore it was true. I told them what I saw, what I ate in detail. My tata told me that it was impossible because my nana Petra had just died that morning. Also, they mentioned that my nana didn't have a daughter, only sons. My tata then called my uncle over and they drove to my nana Petra's house, and I was never told anything after what they had found. Until I got older, my uncle told me that when they went to her house, they found the door open. The stove was hot, but the water pillar was empty. Also, the daughter mentioned, come to find out, when my nana Petra was young, like in her early 20s, she miscarried a baby, a girl. My nana mourned for a very long time for her friend. My uncle was spooked, but they always say that my nana Petra came to say goodbye to my nana. But because I got lost, I sidetracked her, but nonetheless, it was spooky that she fed me, and I physically felt my nana Petra. So I still have a hard time grasping the fact that it had been her spirit and not her physical self. This is another story that happened when I was 5 years old. In Mexico, in the late 90s, my grandparents' ranch didn't have running water, or plumbing system if you will. We had a concrete blockhouse with dirt floors, an outhouse, and we bathed in a nearby river. We did have metal tubs too. If we didn't want to go to the river, we could go to the well and fill them up to bathe. But anyway, it took my grandpa and some of his sons 10 days to expand the house, where I would finally have my own room. The first week I slept fine by myself, until I started seeing the mariachi man. He would wake me up between 2 or 3:30 a.m. I was never scared of him, however. I hated that he would wake me up from my deep sleep. After maybe another week of the man bothering me, I began to talk to him. I realized rather quickly his lips never moved, but I could still hear him speak. He would usually tell me that I needed to listen to him and dig up a certain area of the house, or he would ask me questions about my family. Nothing invasive because I was only 5, and I would go off on tangents if he talked for too long. Anyway, one night he woke me up. He told me that I needed to hurry up and dig up his belongings because he needed to go. I asked him where, and he told me something was hunting him, so I needed to hurry and listen to him now. This time, his tone scared me, so I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a spoon, and he led me to a dark hallway of the house and pointed where I needed to start digging. I listened and I began to dig. As I did, he began to sing a song I knew very well, because my nana sang a lot to me and my singing was that woke up my grandfather. I remember he stood there in the lit area of the hallway and he looked horrified. I remember the man said that I should probably tell my granddad that he was my friend, so I stood up and said, "Papi, this is my friend. You see him, right?" My grandpa didn't respond, just nodded his head. I then went back down and began digging again. "He's the one that wakes me every night. He tells me I have to dig," I explained to my grandpa, who then left without a word and suddenly reappeared with a shovel. I knew my friend was in the darkness. My grandpa came back and looked spooked. "Why do you have to dig?" he asked me. "I don't know, he just keeps telling me I have to," I responded. And he told me to stand up, and he used his shovel to dig where I had started. After my grandpa dug a significant amount and the hole was pretty deep, the mariachi man told me to tell my grandpa to be careful. A metal box was going to come into view. I then passed along the message, and my grandpa put the shovel down and used his hands to keep digging until he uncovered a pretty large metal box. I helped him, or at least I thought he did, pulling the box out, and when he opened it, there was money, like super old Mexican money, some gold coins, jewelry, and paperwork as well. I remember being excited when I saw a bracelet, one I still have to this day, and my grandpa took it outside and washed it with some well water we had put it out on me. I was so young then, but my mom told me my grandpa kept all the stuff in a lockbox in a bank in Mexico. He told me to keep it a secret, and because I was so young at some point, I even forgot that this had happened. But my grandpa ended up telling the story till many, many years later. I never saw my mariachi friend again after we had dug up the box. I sometimes wonder if he really had anything to say, or if he was afraid no one would ever find his belongings. I was 5, but I would still remember that nice man from time to time, even though he liked to wake me up at odd hours.